Turn with me to the first few chapters of Leviticus. I guess we're in the third chapter now, and we're dealing with the peace offerings. We've done the law of the burnt offering in chapter 1, and the law of the meat offering or the meal offering in chapter 2. We've seen how these were prophetic of Christ, but it also shows us a lot of New Testament doctrine. When we try to understand New Testament doctrine without understanding the foundations in the Old Testament, we often run aground and we get some strange ideas. Now, I think that that's probably at least half the reason why we have so many different denominational beliefs. I think if every church really did a serious study on the Old Testament with an open mind and with the ability to change the original doctrines that are set in granite, most of them, they can't change unless they destroy the whole institution. If they would do a serious study in the Old Testament, I believe that they would come largely to the same conclusions because the Scriptures are pretty clear. It's not all that difficult to understand once you see it. But of course, I guess maybe that requires a bit of divine insight, because without the Holy Spirit operating in that regard, we're pretty helpless to see things. We're blind to the moment we see. The peace offering deals with reconciliation, not justification. And we're going to see the differences and the comparisons between these two terms from a New Testament perspective, but of course we will be teaching from Leviticus 3, my favorite book, though not necessarily my favorite chapter. I like the whole book. It's on reconciliation. That's what peace is all about, the peace offering. So you justify sinners, you reconcile enemies. Enemies need to have peace between them. Sinners need to be justified, that is, they need to be justified before the law. The law is what condemns people for sin, because the law is what defines sin. Sin is a transgression of the law. We don't know what sin is except the law tells us, according to Paul. When we tie this in with the feast days, we see that the three feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, Passover is the first feast, which deals with our justification. Pentecost, which was the giving of the law, is actually the beginning of our leading or our being led by the Spirit in our wilderness experience with God. It's the in-between stage from Egypt to the Promised Land. It's really more of what life is all about. Our justification is kind of in a sense, a momentary experience, and people often will point to the year, the day, the hour when they got saved. And what they really mean is when were justified by faith in the blood of the Lamb. But that, even though the blood continues to be applied to us from then on, even so, it really is almost like a momentary experience here, an enlightenment or a time of faith. But after that is a long period of time, which we would call sanctification. Here is where reconciliation overlays. Another way to put this, when we were justified by faith, well, no, let's go even further back than that. When Jesus died on the cross, He provided the means for our justification, but what He actually did was to conciliate the world. Okay? And that was accomplished at the cross. Now, what do we mean conciliate? Well, let's go to Romans chapter 5 before we even get into Leviticus 3. Just to see the differences here, we got to define our terms. Much of what we'll be dealing with today will be review for you, but I think the value of it will be in putting it together in perhaps a way that you didn't see before. In Romans chapter 5, Paul deals with this beginning in verses 9 through 11. I guess we better start with verse 8 or 7. It's always this context stuff. For scarcely for a righteous man would one die, yet peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commended His love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The Concordant version renders this, while we are yet sinners, Christ died for us. or we are yet. It's the present tense. It's not, we used to be sinners. No, it's while we are yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than, being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God. Now, that's not exactly right. A reconciliation means that both parties have been reconciled. A conciliation means that only one party has been suing for peace and has declared peace. The word here is conciliation. The Greek word is katalasso. It's just a fancy word for a conciliation on a one-way street. In other words, while we are still his enemies, we were conciliated by something God does. God is conciliating us. Think of a war. If you have a war between two nations, or two groups of nations, and then one side of this battle declares peace, or sues for peace, and sends ambassadors for peace, what they are doing is conciliating their enemy. And they've stopped fighting. They say, hey, cease fire. And so now we desire that the other side also conciliate in return so that there can be a reconciliation. And that is the word apokatalasso, as opposed to just katalasso. All right, now we're getting technical here. But these are important terms because the Bible does not use these terms loosely. And when we mistranslate them, it's usually because we do not understand what the writer is actually saying. Most people cannot handle the fact that God is conciliating the world to himself, not imputing their trespasses unto them. And he has committed to us the word of the conciliation. We're ambassadors. God stopped fighting the world, and now he is conciliating the world. And we are the ambassadors that have the ministry of this conciliation. You'll find that in 2 Corinthians 5. The word is conciliation, not reconciliation. If there were already a reconciliation, there would be no more need for us to do a job. He wouldn't need more ambassadors. The fact that he needs ambassadors means that the job isn't done yet. The process is not yet complete. When he justified us, he also conciliated us. Okay? The conciliation comes at his death on the cross. And it's on the basis of the work that he did on the cross. It's on the basis of the feast of Passover that was being fulfilled at that time. But what do you do after Passover? In your own life. When we appropriated that justification and that blood, now we have to deal with God on another level. And that is the fact that we are still his enemies, even though we've been justified and God has conciliated us. It doesn't mean we stop sinning right away. There's where the problem lies. As long as we sin against God, but it's more than that, it's the attitude behind it that causes us to sin. We sin because we have death in us, and it's our weakness. We sin because we disagree with God. If we disagree with God, then we are still his enemies. We have not come to this position of a truce where we say, yes, all the terms by which God is suing for peace will be in agreement. See, God is not conciliating us from a position of weakness. Most wars are that way. Oh, we got blasted by an atomic bomb and now we're going to sue for peace quick before we get another bomb on us. That's a position of weakness. And the strong dictate the terms to the weak. And they say, okay, we won't bomb you if you do this and do that and give this up and give that up and so on. God is not bargaining from a position of weakness. He's bargaining from a position of love. He is conciliating us not because we are so powerful. It's because God is saying, I don't want you to be destroyed. How are we going to destroy God, huh? People try. It doesn't generally work. We've all tried it at one time, I guess, in our own mild manners sometimes. Sometimes, it's just a matter of disagreeing with God. We disagree with him. We disagree with the terms of his conciliation. Well, what are the terms of the conciliation? That's what Leviticus 3 is all about. The terms of this conciliation, or the terms of reconciliation. So let's go on back to Leviticus chapter 3, and let's read this. Verse 1. And if his oblation, or his offering, be a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offer it of the herd, whether it be a male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand upon the head of his offering and kill it at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron's sons and the priests, shall sprinkle the blood upon the altar round about. And he shall offer of the sacrifice of the peace offering, an offering made by fire unto the Lord, the fat that covers the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver. With the kidneys, it shall he take away, and Aaron's son shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is upon the wood that is on the fire. It is an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. Okay, let's go back and pick up some details here. The offering is to be without blemish, of course, which means that ultimately whatever is done here has to be done perfectly before we are in a complete state of reconciliation with God, whereby we may have full fellowship with Him. Okay? Now, fellowship is on 2 terms, or 2 different levels. We know that the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin, and therefore we have fellowship with God. The word fellowship means communion. It's the same word. That is, we have something in common with Him. Everything in common is the ultimate goal. That is, we are in full agreement. But fellowship, can 2 walk together except they be agreed? You see, you can't have fellowship without being in agreement. When we were justified by faith in the blood of the Lamb, we find in 1 John chapter 1 that His blood is what gives us fellowship with God, but it is only the beginning. Who among us can say that our fellowship with God is full and complete? The possibilities are there because the legal format has been established. The foundations are established. But do we really have the kind of fellowship with God that we should have? Well, I know I'm not there yet. I don't know about anybody else. I don't think anybody else is better than I am. We all have the same problems, and I know that just because over the years I have grown and my fellowship with God has increased, I know that there's still room for increasing because I haven't stopped growing yet. Therefore, I'm still growing. I mean, that seems logical enough to me. I don't know why some people think that they got it all now. To me, that kind of makes it almost look like you've stopped growing, You got it all. And if that's where you want to stop, well, then you're welcome to do that. I'm not going to twist your arm. But on the other hand, I want to keep going. Verse 3 talks about the fat that covers the innards, and also verse 9 later talks about the innards that are being put upon the altar to burn. This is the part that is given to God, by the way. You'll find that in this peace offering, this is different from all the others because here is an offering where the one who is offering the lamb or the goat gets to partake of the offering, along with the priest and even the priest's sons. This is the only offering where this takes place. Why? Because it is representing a fellowship, communion, which involves eating with somebody. That's why we like to eat with each other, And in the Bible, it's a bigger deal than it is with us even. When you eat with somebody, that is communion. You don't have to come to church to have communion. We are the church. We don't go to church. The church goes to the meeting place. And so anytime we eat with each other, we are having fellowship. It is communion. Communion is not limited to a once a week or once every 3 months or 4 months or once a year or whatever the case is. It's not limited in that way like we usually have it. Years ago when I had a church in my unenlightened days, when I when I thought that I could do pastoral work, that was before the Lord wrapped my knuckles on it. We had a very good idea. We had potluck every Sunday, and it was very good. We really enjoyed it because that was our communion. So we had communion every week. We just extended it a little bit, and we had meetings all day long, morning, afternoon, because some people were driving for many miles and they didn't want to just turn around and go home after an hour or two. So we made a whole day of it. We had a very good time of fellowship for as long as it lasted. Anyway, the inwards or the innards, as we saw in the law of the burnt offering, the inwards represents the feelings, the emotions, the affections of the heart. This is the first thing, or one of the things here that has to go on the altar before God. This is what God requires. Anything that God gets burned up with fire. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing, or that all that has to go to hell, as they say. No, what it means is that the divine fire tests and purifies everything. Everything must be tried by fire. Everything is tested by fire. The fat will increase the fire, yes. The fat, by the way, represents prosperity. We saw that also in the law of the burnt offering. Prosperity. In other words, everything that we have, everything that God has done for us that has allowed us to prosper in the world, that too must be tried by fire. Everything we have should be tested by the fire so that it is only used for God's glory and for His kingdom. Everything. That's a part of it. That is part of reconciliation with God. When all of the emotions and affections and desires of our hearts and everything that we have is fully devoted to God and subject to Him, His laws, His kingdom, His will, that is a part of reconciliation with God. Now, does that come overnight? Did you get that when you got saved? Well, I didn't. I mean, it was a start, but that didn't come overnight. That is a process of time, and it's a process of living. And so really, it is a part of Pentecost, not a part of Passover. And Pentecost deals with us being offered on the altar of God and being tried by fire. That's why at Pentecost, the fire came down, and everyone was supposed to walk up into that fire. Basically, God was saying, make them a burnt offering. Another way you can say is, at the same time, make them a peace offering. You see? It's primarily a burnt offering, where everything is consumed, but it's also, in this peace offering, there's specifics here that are given to God, just for teaching purposes. Now, the 2 kidneys are also given to God, in verse 4. What do the kidneys signify? Well, in the Bible, the term that is translated kidneys, sometimes it is translated kidneys, other times it's translated by a little different term. Reins, that is R-E-I-N-S, as in reins on a horse. And that's because the kidneys, if you do some dissection, the kidneys have these tubes coming down to the bladder, and it looks like reins. In ancient times, when they dissected the goats and the sheep for the sacrifices, well, what does this represent? Divine guidance. With reins, you guide the horse, and it represents divine guidance. How do we know this? Well, let's go to Psalm 16, verse 7, for an example. And I know this isn't new to many of you, but that's okay. It's new, it's in a new context here. Psalm 16, verse 7, I will bless the Lord who hath given me counsel. My reins also instruct me in the night seasons. And that doesn't necessarily mean that he has to get up to go to the bathroom every night, but the word is kidneys. His kidneys instruct him in the night seasons. Now, are those literally his kidneys? Well, I don't think so. But it's talking about divine counsel. Hearing God's voice. We need to develop our kidneys, not just our heart. See, we talk about the heart. Well, what is the heart? Well, it's just an organ that pumps blood. But no, it's more than that. The heart deals with righteousness. The kidneys deal with divine guidance, or hearing the word. That's the symbolism in the Bible. You know, we don't generally talk in many of these terms anymore. We have some hangovers. We have some leftovers. What do we say about this? I don't want a hangover and I don't want leftovers. What do I want? We've got the heart symbolism down pretty well because the New Testament uses it and we're somewhat familiar with that. So we talk about the heart of the matter and we talk about matters of the heart and things like that. But we don't really talk today in our culture about the kidneys. Kidneys don't really have much meaning to us. But they did in the Old Testament and they did in biblical times. So we need to know the terminology. Got to talk the language in order to understand what's being talked about, right? Look at Psalm 26:2. Psalm 26:2. David says, "Examine me, O Lord, and prove me. Try my kidneys and my heart." There he's got them both in the same paragraph. In other words, try my heart for righteousness, test it, but also test my kidneys for how well I'm hearing you. You see? Both needs to be tested because we don't hear perfectly and our heart is not always right. Look at Psalm 73, verse 21. He says, "Thus my heart was grieved and I was pricked in my reins." Run through in my kidneys. What is that? Well, I must have heard wrong or something, you know. The kidneys weren't functioning quite right. My hearing process, I didn't hear the Lord right or something or other. And this is what grieves him in his heart. Proverbs 23:16. Proverbs 23:16. If you start with verse 12 and go through 19, you'll see the whole thing, the whole context has to do with instruction and correction. And he says in verse 16, "Yea, my kidneys shall rejoice when thy lips speak right things." Verse 19, "Hear thou, my son, and be wise, and guide thine heart in the way." See, he's talking about hearing and obedience, because hearing and obedience are the same Hebrew word. So you can, if somebody, like if I tell one of my children, do this or do that, do the dishes, and they say, okay, and they keep playing their games or watching the television or whatever, did they really hear me? Well, maybe they did with their physical ears, but not in a biblical sense. They don't hear until they obey. Hearing, obedience is hearing. It's the same thing. And it's the same in the Greek word, the same with both Hebrew and Greek. And so when we hear, we obey. So the kidneys does have to do with obedience, whereas the heart deals with righteousness. The last thing, Isaiah 11, verse 5, is probably one of the best. Isaiah 11:5 says, "And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his kidneys." Righteousness is associated with, is the girdle of his loins. Well, if you can see this, we deal with the circumcision of the heart, and that is what brings righteousness. Okay? So it's a heart matter. But faithfulness is the girdle of his loins. Where does faith come from? Faith comes by hearing. That is what surrounds the kidneys. And that's the issue of the kidneys, or the reins. So it's hearing. All right. So let's get back to Leviticus chapter 3. The inwards, the affections of the heart, the fat, which is the prosperity, everything we have. Our divine guidance needs to be in submission to God, because we do not hear correctly all the time. Of course, I have a booklet called Hearing God's Voice. And the second chapter of that is dealing with hearing without idols. There are idols of the heart which prevent us from hearing God correctly. And this is what needs to be submitted to God. It is the idols of the heart. And it's not that some have it and some don't. Everybody starts out with a problem. Nobody hears perfectly all the time. And sometimes those idols fall real hard. I mean, I speak from personal experience. How do you think I know about the idols of the heart? I didn't learn it by following or watching other people. That book is a book about me primarily. And I recognize it in others because I have first seen it in myself. You see? We always see other people's problems after we have, when we have the problem ourselves, right? So anyway, let's see. There's another thing too, and that is the call above the liver in verse 4. Well, what is this call? What is that? C-A-U-L. Well, the call is a veil or a covering. It's an overhang, a veil. It's something that covers the liver. Now, Hebrews 10:20 says, the veil which is his flesh. Remember, Jesus' flesh was a veil that covered the glory that was within. And on the Mount of Transfiguration, when that veil was opened up a bit and unveiled, the glory of God shone through, and the disciples beheld his glory. The veil was also veiling the glory of God in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, where the glory of God was. There were actually 3 veils, not just one. We think that we only have one veil, that's the flesh. No, we don't. Spirit, soul, and body each have a veil around it that has to be broken through. You break through by the process of the path toward God, or the highway of holiness that leads to God, from the outside to the inside. And this, of course, also ties in with the 3 feasts. Our 3 experiences with God, our 3 breakthroughs insofar as a veil is concerned. And we finally get to the Feast of Tabernacles, where we are fully in the presence of God in the Holy of Holies, where we stay and do not need to leave the presence of God. Well, that means that the liver itself represents the glory. The word liver is the Hebrew word kabed, which means heavy or great. The root is kabad, which means honor or glory. Guess what? The root word for liver is glory. The veil that is our flesh, our fleshly tendency, or that which separates us from the glory of God, also must be submitted on the altar in order to come fully into reconciliation with God. And actually there are 3 veils, and all 3 veils must be presented to God in order to come fully into reconciliation with God. So just because we broke through that first veil from the outside into the outer court in the tabernacle doesn't mean that we have now entered into the glory of God. Just because you were justified by faith in the blood of the Lamb, you had your sins forgiven at the brazen altar and dealt with, and even out there is the laver, even though you got baptized, that doesn't mean that you're fully reconciled to God. Not in the sense that God is looking for. That may be all that you are looking for, but that's not all that God is looking for. Some people are happy out there in the outer court. God bless them. But I don't want to stay out there, because there's still 2 more veils that separates me from the glory of God. And I don't want any veil separating me from the glory of God. So if those people who are dissatisfied in the outer court want to keep going, fine. You got to break through another court, and that's called Pentecost. And you come into the holy place. And there's articles of furniture in there that deals with learning about God, learning about the character of God, the candlestick or the lampstand and the table of showbread. You're learning all these things which you would not have learned otherwise because everything else was hidden from you. But even Pentecost is not the full answer. Now, there are many who are satisfied with Pentecost. That's fine. If they are satisfied, don't try to push them through the 3rd veil. They'll resent it. In fact, they probably get fried because they aren't ready for it. They aren't ready for it. You can't go through that third veil without a preparation process. So don't push them through if they're not prepared to go through, because it'll only kill them. Okay? It's the same thing as saying, don't try to pry the eyes open of somebody who is sleeping, because he'll probably belt you one, even though you want him to see. Don't pry their eyes open. Find out whose eyes are open, and then help them get the truth that they're looking for. It's really quite simple. You don't have to force any truth down anybody. Just find out who's hungry and feed them. Find out what they like and feed them what they like. You don't have to force feed anybody. We usually run into problems when we force feed. Anyway, these are the things the 5 things, the fat, the caul, the liver, the kidneys, the inwards, these are the things that must be put upon the altar of God in order for us to have a complete reconciliation. Probably the caul above the liver, which represents the veil, is probably the most specific, most important, because we know that there are 3 veils that have to be penetrated before we can enter into the full presence of the Father. Now, back in Leviticus chapter 3, verses 6 through 11 says that if you offer a lamb, this is what you do. And then in verse 12, if the offering be a goat, then this is what you do. You can offer either a lamb or a goat, and basically the procedures are the same. They're to lay his hand upon the head of the offering, and thereby the one who is offering this peace offering is identifying with the lamb or the goat. Now, there are 2 types of character portrayed here in the lamb and the goat, and we saw this again in the laws of the burnt offering, where we laid down a lot of the basic foundational definitions and symbolism involved in these offerings. The lamb signifies submission, or a submissive heart. The goat signifies strength. You know, the word goat in the Hebrew literally means strength. You can also view this as, when you're looking at it through the eyes of the feast days and the cycle of feast days, the lamb and goat are both eligible in the Passover offering. You can kill either a lamb or a goat at Passover, but primarily it was a lamb. On the Day of Atonement, however, which was 6 months later, 10th day of the 7th month, they were to offer 2 goats. This is not a lamb. This was specifically a goat. So for our purposes, you're dealing here with a time period between Passover and the Day of Atonement, which leads up to the Feast of Tabernacles. So, from the time of your salvation, or your justification by faith, Passover, up to the time when we come into full agreement with God at the Day of Atonement, which is what it's all about, Day of Atonement, coming into agreement with God, learning to be a forgiver, learning to declare a Jubilee, because the Jubilee is also on the Day of Atonement. Of course, this is a bigger subject than we can deal with today, and it's out of our scope. But from Passover to the Day of Atonement, that is what the peace offering is all about. The peace offering should come into its perfection at the Day of Atonement. This is the preparation day for the Feast of Tabernacles. Our peace offerings with God and our experience with God insofar as the peace offering is concerned is applicable in our daily walk up until the time that we enter the promised land, up until the time that we experience tabernacles. At that point, it's kind of irrelevant. You don't have to offer any more peace offerings with God, because it's perfected at this point. You've come into the full reconciliation at that point. Turn to Leviticus chapter 7. There's more about the peace offering in another chapter here. Leviticus 7, beginning with verse 11 through 20. And this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he shall offer with the Lord. If he offer it for a thanksgiving, let me stop right there and say that the word here is thanksgiving or praise or confession, I believe it is. The Septuagint and other translations understand this to mean really praise. So if our peace offering is of praise and worship, this is all worship, but what we would call today praise and worship, which is good, then he shall offer with the sacrifice of thanksgiving unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers anointed with oil, and cakes mingled with oil of fine flour fried. Besides the cakes he shall offer for his offering leavened bread with the sacrifice of thanksgiving of his peace offerings. Now this is interesting. You have both unleavened and leavened bread involved here, and this ties it in with the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of Leavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread comes at Passover. Passover is day one of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's the barley harvest. It's the unleavened bread. You can't leaven barley because there's no gluten. Won't do any good. So barley is generally unleavened bread, although you can unleaven or you can keep a non-leavened wheat as well. But it also says that you are to offer leavened bread. Now, isn't that interesting? Because, again, this shows that this sacrifice of praise, which we are to offer God, is first of all covering from the Feast of Unleavened Bread through the Feast of Pentecost, and that takes us primarily all the way to the Day of Atonement before we get to Tabernacles. So whether we are merely justified by faith, or if we are Pentecostally filled with the Spirit, either way, whether it's unleavened or leavened bread, it is still acceptable to God here because it's offered unto God. Now that's quite interesting to me. But it also speaks to some extent of the condition of the church in the time that they are offering peace offerings unto God. Because remember, there are two types of peace offerings. This is the first kind. And this I find to be a simple offering given by one who is thanking and praising God for what he has done for him. And it speaks of the Passover type of Christian and those of Pentecost, but it is not the highest form of reconciliation or peace offering yet. Nonetheless, it's acceptable. It's acceptable. Now it says in verse 15, "And the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving or praise shall be eaten the same day that it is offered. He shall not leave any of it until the morning." That sound familiar? What other type of what other feast has this type of instruction in it? Passover. Exactly. They were to eat the Passover lamb and leave nothing of it until morning. Anything left in the morning was to be burned. You don't leave any of it until morning. It was to be consumed in one day. Passover. And again, it deals with a Passover type of Christian. But now, look at verse 16. "If the sacrifice of his offering be a vow or a voluntary offering, it shall be eaten the same day that he offers his sacrifice, and on the morrow also the remainder of it shall be eaten, but the remainder of the flesh of the sacrifice on the third day shall be burnt with fire." How is it that you can eat it for 2 days if it's a vow or a voluntary offering? Now, we think of vows as being something that is an obligation, right? We think of a voluntary offering as being non-obligatory, right? Actually, they're kind of the same thing, because you didn't have to make the vow to start with. A vow is a voluntary obligation that you took upon yourself. That's what a voluntary offering is. Really, it's the same thing. And that's why he's just putting it in another way here. It's a voluntary offering. You volunteered for duty. You volunteered for service. This is actually the whole purpose of Pentecost. You see, you were justified by faith in the blood of the Lamb. It did not require any vow on your part. It did not require any works on your part. It didn't require any righteousness on your part. It's all done by Christ. He is the Passover Lamb. But when you come to Pentecost, it's an entirely different story. When Israel went to Pentecost at Mount Sinai, what did they do? They vowed a vow. That was what they did. They came to the base of the mount and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do and be obedient. They took a vow. Now, did they have to? No, they could have stayed back at the shores of the Red Sea and kept dancing with Miriam and thought they were in the Promised Land. Sure, they could have kept doing that. They could have said, hey, I'm free, at last I'm, free. And never have any obligation to do anything, and all they would have been is justified by faith, and they'd be baby Christians. But if they're on their way to the Promised Land, the way goes through Mount Sinai. Always. Never goes direct. It's not a direct route. It's always through Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, the fire came down on the mount, and he spoke the Ten Commandments. He spoke the law to the people. The people made a vow to be obedient to the law. Pseudo-Pentecost, you know what pseudo-Pentecost is? It's where people come to the mount and they want to run rings around it and do a whole lot of dancing and praising and worship, but they don't want to have any vows of obedience. They don't want to obligate themselves to do anything to come into obedience and reconciliation with God. It's a place where they say, well, the law is all thrown out. We don't want the law. That's bad stuff. That's Mount Sinai. Well, sure, it's Mount Sinai. What do you expect? That's where Pentecost started. So we throw the law out and we substitute church law. Because man can't live without laws. It can't be lawless. You want to live in a lawless society? Even the church can't do that. People get killed that way. People get robbed that way. And if enough people get killed and robbed, pretty soon they say, well, we better have a couple of rules here. Otherwise, we're not going to survive this. Of course you've got to live by laws. Laws are what restrain evil. Laws aren't going to save you. I didn't say that they would. Nobody's going to be justified by the law. See, people often think that Israel came out of Egypt at Pentecost. What that means is they put Pentecost over Passover and they say, see, you're saved by faith and by doing this. Which means that if you're saved by faith and your works, or by works alone, you see, are we putting Pentecost in with Passover? Are we making them the same feast? We shouldn't be doing this. Let's keep Passover and Pentecost distinct. Let's never put works, or our works are good works, which basically are defined by the works of the law. Let's not put that in with Passover. Let's keep it in Pentecost where it belongs. But let's not throw out Pentecost either. And let's not throw out the law, because the law is revolved around Pentecost. Pentecost is the place where we have the law written on our hearts, or the beginning of the law written on our hearts. And it comes by hearing the Word. And that's why God spoke the Ten Commandments at Pentecost at Mount Sinai, and they all heard the voice of God speaking in their own language. Now, of course, the problem with Pentecost, which began under Moses, is that they all ran. Oh, don't let God talk with us lest we die. Just let Moses tell us what God said, and we can survive that. And so they didn't want the law direct from God, which would have burned it upon their hearts and actually changed their nature. They wanted it in written form, indirect, not knowing that they would still need the Holy Spirit to write it on their hearts, to transfer it from the pages of stone or paper, whatever we use, to our hearts. This is a sacrifice of a vow or a voluntary offering. This is, if you have moved from a Passover stage of the praise and worship and so on, and now you're coming into something where you are obligating yourself to be obedient to God, now you're really beginning to come into reconciliation with God, not just with the sacrifice of praise, but also by obligating yourself and saying, I will be obedient to the voice of God. That's something entirely different, unfortunately. Really, it ought to be taught in the same place. People should move directly into that. But, we should get into Pentecost as soon as we can after Passover. If we don't, we may sit around praising God and having a playtime, party time, but we never get serious about what God is up to. This is related directly to the law in Exodus 21. Exodus 21, after God spoke the Ten Commandments to the people in chapter 20, and they all ran, and Moses had to go up and get the rest of the law, here is the law that he came down the mount with. This is what he came down with. This is what the people should have heard directly from God, but didn't. And they had to get it through Moses. And the problem is still the same. Everybody has heard of the Ten Commandments. Most Sunday school kids have memorized the Ten Commandments at one point or another. A lot of churches have them posted on the walls. Guess we don't here. It's okay, we got it written on our hearts, right? Oh, yeah, there you go, the 10 promises of the New Covenant. That's right. The same as the 10 Commandments of the Old Covenant. The only difference is that the 10 promises are, this is what God says He's going to do. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill. And that's a promise of God. Under the New Covenant, it's something that God intends to do in us. Under the Old Covenant, it's something we do for God. New Covenant, He does it for us. The result is the same. Well, it's actually not the same, because when we try to do it ourselves, we kind of mess up. When God does it, we end up being obedient to these laws because He put it in our hearts. When it's in our hearts, how do we know it's in our hearts? It's in our hearts. We know it's in our hearts, and the evidence is there because we don't even want to kill or steal or commit adultery or covet and things like that. In Exodus 21, this begins the set of laws that the people did not hear. I'm kind of fond of asking people where I go once in a while. I say, you all know the Ten Commandments? Oh, yes. And I say, well, what's the next law? And I get a bunch of blank stares. It's the same problem today as it was back then. Everybody had the Ten Commandments because that much the people could hear. Oh, they ran, but at least they did hear it. But after that, this is a part of the law that nobody else heard. So Moses wrote it down, but, people still haven't read it. This is not in people's hearts because they haven't even heard of this yet. How in the world are they going to have it in their hearts if they've never even read the thing? The Holy Spirit will lead you in many ways, and so in many ways the law will be written in your heart. To get a real understanding of what God is showing us, we need to actually read it in the Word. That's why we need to live by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Did this come out of the mouth of God? Yes. In Exodus 21, verse 2 says, If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve. In the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. Verse 5, If the servant shall say plainly, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. It doesn't mean he puts an awl through his head. It's through the earlobe. A servant had an earring from then on. We see a lot of earrings these days. I don't know who their master is, but this is signifying a bondservant. A bondservant. I think ultimately, if the church doesn't proclaim this law, even the world will. They don't even know what they're doing. Ultimately, I think the reason why we got all these earrings out there is it's ultimately because God is saying, see, they will become my bondservants at some point. This is a voluntary vow or a voluntary obligation that the servant has taken. He is being set free but then he comes back and says, I don't want to leave. I love my master. In biblical slavery, if a master truly loves God and knows his law, all the slaves under him will rejoice. And they'll say, hey, why would I ever want to leave? That's biblical slavery. Man's kind of slavery, which affords the slaves no rights, and which gives masters the right to oppress them and everything. That's why we have something called the Emancipation Proclamation. That's why we have laws against slavery. It's really against man's abuse of slavery. But we have employees out here. That's being a servant, right? Servant, employee, it's the same thing. But a bondservant, somebody who must serve, Most people do not want to be under an obligation like that, because people are people. But in a true biblical sense, God has freed us from the bondage of sin. We call that Passover. Like Israel was freed from Egypt, so are we freed by the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. Now what? Do we want to say, oh, good, I get to be free now, I can do whatever I want? No. Now we come back to God, and when we say, I love my master and I want to be obedient, go ahead. Bore my ear to the door. Open my ears. See, it has to do with hearing. That has to do with true Pentecost. True Pentecost is where we voluntarily come and are a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Like Paul says. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. He's a bondslave. Where did he get the idea? He got it from Exodus 21. He used to live in those days when this happened a lot. Unfortunately, in our American culture, we don't know much about this because this doesn't happen. You know, we're in a foreign land, if you will. But we need to be free bondservants. We got a tape on that one, which we did some months back. Psalm chapter 40 tells us about this Exodus law. We'll just tie things up here. We're almost done. I see some of you are on overload, getting brain bruised. It's okay. We'll let you out and give you some frankincense to deal with your post-concussion syndrome. Psalm 40, verse 6. Sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. Then said I, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. What's he saying here? Now this is quoted in Hebrews 10, verses 5 through 9, in relation to Jesus Christ, and he is our example. He came to do the will of the Father, and he did it perfectly. He's our example of one who is in full reconciliation, or full fellowship with the Father. And how did it manifest? His ears he opened. What does it mean? It means he came to the doorpost and said, open my ears, bore my ear to the door, because I want to be a voluntary bondslave and do nothing except what I see my Father do. Say nothing except what I hear my Father say. And be a true and faithful witness. In other words, to be an amen people. I always talk about the amen people. People who can say amen to God in everything. Everything that God has said we are in full agreement with. There's still some things I wonder about. So God is still working on me in some areas. My ears has now opened. Lo, I come. What coming? He's coming back. He's saying, I don't want to be free. I'm going to come back and get my ears bored. And it says, why would he do that? It says, because I delight in your will. Your law is within my heart. Why would a slave not want to be freed? It's because the rules of the household are so good, and he's in so much in agreement with it, he'd want to come back. He says, who wants to live under any other old rule? These are the best things that ever happened to me. See? When I was bought as a slave here to start with, I didn't agree. But when I learned it, because I was learning by obedience, by the time I got through with serving my term, I don't want to leave. You see? His laws are so righteous, and they're so equitable, so just, so good. The law is holy and just and good, as Paul says. When the law is in our hearts, then we will want to have our ear bored to the door. Because the reason his law is in our hearts is because we have heard. And we've been obedient. And now we don't have to be, we want to be. That's the difference between a Passover Christian and a true Pentecostal. Or it's the difference between a pseudo-Pentecostal and a true Pentecostal. Are you obedient because you have to be? Oh, this law says I got to do it, so, well, okay, I'll just have to do it and force myself to be obedient to this law. Or are we in full agreement? If we're in full agreement, then we will want our ears bored to the door. That is coming as a voluntary servant. A voluntary offering is what it's all about. That is taking upon oneself a vow of obedience and service. And that is the second type of peace offering that really is the goal of it. This is really what God is looking for. He's not just looking for people who are going to stand around and praise and worship Him. That's good, but that's only type 1. He's really looking, the offering be a vow or a voluntary offering. It should be eaten on the same day. And you know, the reason I believe that it's the same day and the morrow and then the third day it's burned with fire. What does this signify? Prophetically speaking, well, first of all, it identifies with Jesus' death. You know, and on the third day he was raised. He shows the pattern. But also, that was the fulfillment of Hosea chapter 6. After 2 days he will revive us. In the third day he will raise us up. And this deals with a day being 1,000 years as well. It deals with the Pentecostal age. So that when you come out at the other end into the Feast of Tabernacles, which is what we look forward to now, because as of a few months ago, it was 2,000 years since Jesus' birth. We've kind of entered into the third day now. And in the third day, the offering is accepted by fire. In a sense, this voluntary offering is a 2-day period. It's a 2,000-year period. On the third day, it shall be burnt with fire. What happens when you burn things in fire? Well, it vaporizes. It turns to smoke, right? It goes from a solid to it's offered up to God. It speaks of resurrection and transfiguration. Matter is dense. It's compact energy. And the fire releases that into a whole new freedom. And this becomes the sweet savor to God. This is what God's nose really likes to smell. He's really looking for a good meal. He's looking for you on his plate. That's what he's saying. What is a sweet savor unto God? What is it that really makes him hungry and smack his lips? Boy, I just can't wait until these people are a full voluntary offering and they're in full agreement with me in reconciliation. That's what God really, really enjoys. And that's what this peace offering is all about. Reconciliation with God and how to do it. How to get there. Okay, I guess we'll stop there.